All right, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Greetings to you, new listeners, returning friends, whoever you are that has chosen to listen today. I hope that this moment is finding you reasonably well. And I'm wondering, how many of you find yourself in a liminal space of transition about now? Are you in between a former version of yourself or former version of your life and something new that you don't know yet? Well, if you've been around, you know that I've jumped off a cliff and decided to try and open a yoga center in my neighborhood. And I'm happy to report that the fundraising campaign has hit 80% of its goal. Continues to be both a humbling and wonderful experience of feeling that there are people who care enough to want to help me. And that's been really something and been really vulnerable. That's the word that comes to mind the most. Like I was out and about with my wife and daughter and we ran into another family. And they are on my mailing list. I know they actually made a contribution. And, you know, the husband, who I don't really know that well, but we've chatted a couple times. It was interesting the way he said a really nice thing. He said, "Congratulations on the space, Jay." And he was like, there was a look in his face that I hadn't seen from him before. That me sharing what's going on inside me in that raw kind of way did seem to break through what would normally be some kind of barrier. And it was really interesting and cool and also felt slightly uncomfortable. I gotta admit, because, you know, I'm revealing myself. It's like standing naked in front of people or something. And I was struck by that again just yesterday because I was spending some time with my youngest daughter, Annabelle. She's just about to turn 10 years old. And I was looking at something on the computer. I was checking something with the fundraising campaign. And Annabelle said, "What's that?" And I said, "Oh, this is a fundraising campaign that I started to help me open the yoga center." She was like, "Really?" And I said, "Yeah, look at this. Like 190 people have donated all this money to help me." And she said, "Wow, what does it say?" Because I had the blog post there and I was like, "Oh, this is a blog post that I wrote about my situation and asking for help." And she said, "Well, can I read it?" And I said, "Yeah, of course, if you want to read it." I said, "Actually, you know, I recorded myself reading it. Do you want to hear that?" And she said, "Yeah." So I went to the episode from a few weeks ago where I read the blog post. I didn't play like the whole episode for her. I just fast forwarded to the blog post and she listened to me reading it. And after she heard it, she had this like really beautiful, loving look in her eye and she hugged me and she said, "Dad, I love you so much." But later she was, I don't know, feeling really emotional about some of the things that she heard. And she didn't feel like she could talk to me about it, but she talked to my wife about it. And she was saying that it felt really weird to hear me like that, to hear me cry or to hear me say something about, you know, barely being able to pay the mortgage and keep the kids fed. Like to hear me expressing that vulnerability made her feel really weird, you know, made her, you know, like she didn't, I guess you don't normally see your parents that way till much later in life. Like, I don't think I've ever heard my dad reflect on himself in that kind of way. And it's something that I've been doing for a lot of years in the blog writing and in this show. And I didn't think about it at all playing it for Annabelle, I felt that I want my daughters to know me as best as they could. I've always had it in mind that maybe someday they would want to go back and listen to these intros and outros, and they could certainly learn a lot about who their dad is. But it just struck me so much about that simple thing of really, one, I guess, being as honest as you can with yourself about what's going on with you. And then just like having the guts to just share it with somebody. Maybe not with like the whole world, but even just one person, you know? That we show ourselves to each other. And that is very much in the spirit of my talk today with Brad Wetzler. Brad and I met some years ago, and I knew a little bit about him, not much, but he is someone who has spent time helping other people write their own stories. And now he has written his story in a new book called Into the Soul of the World. And I think that Brad accomplishes that same vulnerability and sharing. And his story really touches on so many of the themes that I like to talk about on the show, whether that's materialist frameworks or Western medicine pros and cons, or even more of the recent stuff with my daughter Annabelle and her mental health and navigating the kinds of treatments that we have for mental health. And all of these things really come together in Brad's story. And I've really enjoyed reading his book and connecting with him. And it's a real pleasure for me to be sharing it with you today. Real quick before we get to it, let me mention that if you want to connect with me in ways outside of just listening to this show, there's lots of opportunities for us to do that. I have a range of on-demand videos. I've got live classes and a discussion group. And maybe you want to get access to the full-length archives of this show and support this show with a podcast premium subscription. All of the stuff that I'm doing can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay. I think that will be it for now. I will touch base with you on the other side, but let's go ahead and get into it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Brad Wetzler. Hello.
Jay.
There you are.
Hey.
What's going on, man?
Hey, good to see you. Been a while.
Brad, it's good to speak with you, my friend. It has been a minute. I know you're familiar with the show. I am recording. Let's consider ourselves having begun, okay?
That sounds great. And yes, I've been a big fan of the show for a long time.
Oh, well, I'm glad you reached out, and it was interesting for me to reflect back on the period of time when you and I had our interaction, and we spent a little time together in Zoom meetings previously.
Yeah.
And my memory is that you were maybe putting together like a way of teaching groups of people or helping facilitate, or you were doing one-to-one mentoring or coaching, maybe helping people write their books, maybe.
Yeah.
And then you were putting together, like wanting to make it like people could pay a subscription and all be part of a group to do it together, like to write your story of healing.
Yes.
Essentially. And I do remember kind of being in contact with you at some point where you had mentioned that you were writing your story of healing, which I'm assuming has come to fruition in the book that you sent me entitled Into the Soul of the World. Is that correct, Brad?
That's correct. All of that's correct. And the book came out a year ago, March, from Hachette, and it's called Into the Soul of the World, as you know. And it's my story of kind of how I became a successful adventure writer at a great cost, and how my life collapsed, and how through many things, including especially yoga, I pulled myself and my life back together again. So,
Well, I have to say, at the time, it was such a bizarre moment. The world was completely shut down, if I'm not mistaken. We were all online. We were all navigating the independent media space in one way or another.
yeah.
And I knew that you had written for like a lot of different places and had a career as an editor, but I didn't really know the extent of it until I was reading your book. And I did read a good portion of it. I still have a lot to read, and I will definitely be going back to read it. Let me just say for anybody listening and just to you, it's wonderfully written and very engaging and easy to read. And I've been enjoying it in the last few days since you sent it. So my compliments to you. It's really, really quite fantastic.
And thank you for spending time with it. Yeah.
Yeah, no. And I guess when I met you, this was all very much in the past in the book. Like, does that period of time play into does that come at the end of the book, or was that all before we met?
Wait, say that again. I didn't quite understand.
Like the period of time when we met in January, whatever, or I don't know, January 2022 or 2021. I can't even remember which one.
2020 it was, yeah.
In 2020, it was actually that early on.
So yeah, we met right during the pandemic, yeah.
Okay, so
or actually right before the pandemic, and then we continued on throughout the pandemic. So yeah.
So when I had met you at that time, had you already lived the story that's in the book, or did it coincide with the ending at all? I guess is what I'm curious about.
Yeah. Well, both and. I mean, the book itself ends in 2019 on a trip to India, but then there's an epilogue where I kind of update the reader on what's happened since then. And that covered the pandemic period. So it was sort of right in the middle of things. And I was working on the book proposal, I think, when we first started talking. And so I sent that book proposal off in 21 and got an agent and got a book deal and then wrote the book throughout 21 and 22.
Okay, got you. Well, I guess the thing that intrigued me off top, the amount of medications that you were taking for periods of time in your life. I recently went through my daughter taking some medication. I've never taken any antidepressant meds myself, but I certainly educated myself quite a bit about it. And there was even, while I was educating myself about it, was right around when the thing came out that they revealed that they couldn't even really explain how the serotonin uptake inhibitors were helping. They could show it was helping, but they couldn't show why because they couldn't recreate I read this thing right in the middle of it.
Yeah.
And I listed, there was you had a cocktail of 8 of really heavy duty medications that you were on for a really long time. And I guess I'm curious.
It was 12, actually. 12 or 13. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I guess, are you on medication now at all? I mean, I don't mean anybody to hear this to think I have any problem with medications, that having had them serve a purpose, but also felt like the protocols didn't have any exit plan for them.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was a disaster. I was on, like I said, 12 or 13 pills a day, 23 or 4 actual pills per day. And it was all for a misdiagnosis, in a way, which I'll tell you about. But so today I do take Wellbutrin. It's the one thing I take. And, when I was getting off all those medications, I had to work with a psychiatrist. And he convinced me that people who have had significant bouts of depression in the past are prone to them in the future, almost regardless of how much self-work and how much healing you do, which I've done a lot, and I stayed on Wellbutrin, and it seems to work well for me right now. And so there's a lot of talk about the dangers of medications in this book, but there's at the end I arrive at still taking one. So,
well, but I suppose taking one is very different than taking 12.
Definitely.
Because that's the thing that I did notice. There was a thing where they stack them. So you're taking one thing for one thing, and there's a side effect from that thing, and you take another one to stack on top of that.
Yeah.
At some point, you don't really know what's doing what anymore, it seems to me.
Yeah, can I quickly tell the story? When I was 24, I was suffering from depression in college. I'd been depressed since I was a teenager, and my uncle had been seeing a psychiatrist and had been really excited about his new bipolar diagnosis, and it was sort of trendy at the time. He was a successful person, and he said, I want to take you to the psychiatrist because I kind of think you are too. And I was very gullible, very vulnerable. And I went to the psychiatrist. I told him some stories for about 45 minutes, told him about my depression, but also about some mystical experiences I had when I was young. At the 45-minute mark, he writes out a prescription and hands me a prescription for lithium for bipolar disorder. And that was the first step. And then over time, I bought into the whole system until I was eventually, the depression was so bad during my career that I, he said that our only option is either electroconvulsive therapy or antipsychotics. And I've never been psychotic, but I chose antipsychotics, and that's when I basically went to bed for 4, 5, 6 years. I don't even know how long it was.
To me, that story points to something that I also observed, that there's sort of like a different range of care that gets offered in the Western kind of medical establishment addressing of mental health issues. And one of them is the med side. And then one of them is like people who like connect with you and have relationship and other stuff. And my daughter would say she referred to the meds doctor as a robot because he was mainly like kind of plugging in data points. Like, does she have friends? Check. Does she, you know what I mean? Like there was like these boxes to check that would equal the diagnosis and the protocol to follow. And he wasn't really like looking to know her in any kind of way.
Yeah.
And I guess that kind of distinguishing, because my daughter she's off meds now, but she still sees her therapist because she considers her a friend. Like, and she's had a person to talk to that isn't her mom and dad. And I just think that's actually been a very helpful thing for her. And she loves her. They're great friends. It's a beautiful thing. But that doctor giving you that diagnosis, do you have, are you like, I feel like I would have a lot of resentment around that. I know I bring it up also just to say also, anybody who might listen to this, like I was recently having a conversation with a friend of mine who received a diagnosis. And I think for that person, it was very helpful. Like sometimes getting a diagnosis for something that's been about you for a long time, it can be kind of clarifying and helpful and like help you address it in a clearer way. But sometimes it feels like it takes agency away from you.
It definitely did for me. I was happy when I got the diagnosis. I had a very troubled childhood with my family. I'd been essentially pushed out of it, scapegoated as an alcoholic, narcissistic family. And it let me off the hook and it let them off the hook, as this was a brain situation. And of course, 20 years later, after losing half of my kidney function to lithium and getting off all the meds, I had a doctor said, let's figure out who you really are. And he decided that I was actually suffering from complex PTSD. And so, of course, that's a whole other, you can embrace that too. But I spent 20 years living inside a diagnosis that was untrue. Yeah, and wow. accepting that I would never be healed, and accepting then, therefore, that the only path was medication. And you asked about resentment. I just want to chime in real quick. I have some, but I actually, I see that period as addiction for me now, and it's there is a sort of a thing now about addiction to psych meds, and I was uncomfortable in my skin. I was suffering from depression, flashbacks, all these things, and I needed it to go away. And instead of using street drugs or weed or something, I was working at a high level in journalism, and I found my pusher. He had a white coat on.
And in a way, that's for the social position you had, as you mentioned, you were working for the New York Times and all these high-powered journalistic institutions. That's the more acceptable one. Like,
yeah.
you can get away with that one better than heroin.
Yeah.
For a time, but
For a time.
eventually it does catch up with you. Like, how many years were you on like that many meds? You mentioned it again.
So it was a slow build. So it started in 1990 with lithium. By 1996, I had added, Prozac, Wellbutrin, some anxiety drugs, sleep drugs, and as time went on and into the early 2000s, when they added the antipsychotics, so it was a slow build. And by 2003 or so, I was, he put me on Dexedrine because I wasn't getting out of bed. And that turned me into just a complete zombie. I was walking around town. I could get out of bed because Dexedrine's a really powerful stimulant. And yet I couldn't feel my heart. I couldn't feel a thing. So it was it's kind of complex, but it was a slow build until eventually I couldn't write anymore. I'd walk to the cafe carrying magazines and try to read, articles in magazines that I had cover stories in just several years earlier.
Yeah, I wrote a quote. If it's okay, I'm going to read a quote from your book, if that's all right. It goes to what you just said. You wrote, "Either I was a label, adventurer writer, and an adjective, successful, or I was my diagnosis, a sick person, a failure. I deconstructed myself, diminished myself, abused myself, limited myself, and allowed others to do it to me. And I was tired." And I read that and I was like, oh, gosh. Even like the kind of struggle between like the outward career identity success thing that we're born into culturally, and then the inner suffering of a spirit dying, or you know what I mean? Something like that. So when in the midst of this high-powered writing career and drug addiction, as you describe it, legal drug addiction, I guess you would say, although now there's a lot of drugs that are getting more legal, so it could be that's not always the distinguishing characteristic. When does yoga start to become something that you're doing in there? Do you remember? I saw somewhere Santa Fe community yoga. Was that your first spot? When does yoga come into the picture?
Yeah, 1994. My friends Andrew and Madeline had been practicing yoga. We'd moved from Chicago to Santa Fe. The whole magazine had, and this is Outside magazine. And in '94, I really was fascinated. They were working with T.S. Little and in Santa Fe, and they had gone to India and been to Varanasi, and so I started going to a class with first Rima Miller, who had been T.S.'s ex-wife, and then a guy named Michael Hopp, who had Santa Fe Community Yoga Center. I didn't feel worthy of T.S.'s classes, but I just loved the community yoga. It was sort of like pay as you could, real hippy-dippy, people in sweats and carpeting on the floor, but it was awesome. And they had a table of saints on the front, and I was fascinated by that. I was sort of a journalist, science guy, but I also had this mystical kind of part of me thread running through. Anyway, I fell in love with yoga then, and it, while it did leave me during my drugged out period, I really couldn't practice anymore. I was overweight. It was always kind of a little bit a seed inside me, and then as soon as I began my kind of comeback, it became the integral part of it.
Well, you mentioned that you had some like other experiences in your life, and you mentioned that you actually said that to the therapist. That's why he gave you the diagnosis.
Yes.
Because you talked about Jesus to him, didn't you?
I did.
You had a Jesus thing as a kid, which a lot of kids do. My wife recently, I've been exploring the Bible in new ways for myself, and I was talking to my wife, and she mentioned that when she was a kid, she had this whole period of time where she felt this intense relationship to Jesus. Yeah. And you write in the book that you had that too. Is that what you told the therapist when he was like, "Oh, you're bipolar"?
Yeah, I had sort of fallen in love with Jesus. I was sort of listening kind of obsessively to Jesus Christ Superstar. I was in love with Mary Magdalene, and I was Jesus was my friend and my uncle kind of. And And but as I got into sort of periods of insomnia and the depression started in teenage years, I woke up one night and I was having mystical experiences, and a doctor would say I was dissociating, probably, but I stood in the mirror and in my tidy whities, and I had this moment of merging, and I told him this story. And again, this wasn't a chronic thing happening, upsetting my life. And I do think that was the crowning thing that got me the diagnosis.
Well, it's so interesting to me because it's a conversation I've been having on the show a lot, as you may know, about like where the kind of materialist frame ends and some idea of there being something more than just a material merges. So if a doctor doesn't believe that there's anything outside of a material frame, and a 24-year-old person is having mystical experiences and shares them with the doctor, the logical conclusion is, oh, this person has a mental disorder.
Yeah, but that speaks mostly to the limitation of that worldview, right? I mean, later on, I had therapists tell me it was so normal, and I heard Jack Kornfield. I listened to his podcast for decades, and him saying more than half the Americans have had mystical experiences, and almost all of them wish that they would never have one again. Was some quote he had, and so I now see it as part of being a human being.
Yeah, it's quite a natural thing. It's just, I guess sometimes you're noticing it or articulating in a way that because sometimes I think people are having those experiences, but it's not really registering or not noticing it as such or putting words to it. Maybe that's the writer gene in you or something at a young age, sort of articulating it in some way. And you're trying to articulate something that probably doesn't really have much words for it if you don't have any experience to compare to it,
Yeah, I think that was such a huge part of it, and I also had a lot of anger then at my family, I have to say, and of course I later learned that this psychiatrist was friends with my dad, and so I'd had a lot of anger at about my family situation and how my father's drinking and the fact that I sort of basically got pushed out of it, and so the anger was part of it too, and the anger can be part of bipolar, and it was a perfect storm. I mean, I walked into my own executor, I guess, or in some ways. I mean,
Well, it's also interesting to me the way that you have managed to kind of work through your own personal stuff through your work too, because I do that in terms of the podcast or whatever writing I've done, where you're utilizing your own kind of process and story to find your way. So you mentioned that you had this Jesus thing as a kid. At some point in your book, I was reading that when it all really is falling apart for you and you can no longer kind of keep up the charade of this person who's not a total drug addict or whatever it is, you get a gig walking and you go back to Jesus for a minute.
Yeah. So I'd moved on in life. I'd gotten off some of the medications, but I had this friend who died by suicide, and when he died, he told me he might do it, and I really had very little to say to him at the time. And after he died, I just went into this place and I found my Bible in my storage unit, and I saw a little tidbit and I think it was the New York Times or Wall Street Journal or something about this formation of a Jesus trail in Israel, and it went from Nazareth to the Sea of Galilee, and I was just like, I was there, and I wrote my editor, I'd written for it in the travel section of the New York Times. I told her about it, and 10 minutes later, I got an email back, go. And so I hadn't written in years, and I went downstairs and told my girlfriend at the time that I was leaving in 24 hours and to go to Israel. And I knew I was going to hike the trail, but I also knew I was going to stick around and explore and walk in Jesus' footsteps. And I knew I wouldn't be back for a month or more, so...
Okay, so I have to say I was intrigued by that part of the book. I've spent some time with it, maybe more than others, because I've been recently talking about on the show that my whole life I never have looked to the Judeo-Christian religions in any way because I associated them with just oppression and hierarchy and patriarchy and hypocrisy, essentially, especially whatever expressions of those religions I saw in my childhood in the 80s in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles, where it was like coked out at Temple or whatever, it was much safer and easier for me to go to Eastern spirituality in a way. Like I've never even thought of the Bible in any kind of way or considered it or engaged it in the way that I have, say, the Yoga Sutras or the Bhagavad Gita. Like I've kind of engaged with those spiritual texts in like a personal, deep way. But I had never done that with the Bible before. And I have been doing that. So I've been kind of getting a lot out of it and kind of really reflecting on Jesus and sort of the questions around him, which you do kind of talk about some in the book. I don't know that you and I arrive at the same conclusions, but it was interesting to me that you did not just go to Eastern, but you did take a moment to look at Jesus and walk in those footsteps. And I guess what from that trip in your mind was there a reason, or was there a particular takeaway or a part of the puzzle for you that journey in Jesus's footsteps took?
Yeah. This is 2012, and so I was still pretty locked up in a materialist worldview for the most part, and so there was kind of an irony when I got done with it. I basically, and I write about this, I failed to see the message in it. I failed to see the message of the heart and mercy and forgiveness and all of those types of things. I'd been so kind of obsessed with walking the trail and thinking I could somehow absorb something from traveling through that land. And, I will say I've arrived at a different place today than in 2012, where I see, especially for us Westerners, the gift of that path and the need for mercy, to ask for mercy, and the need to hold ourselves underneath. We're so narcissistic over here in the world, and I think there's just a way that path can help us deal with our own learned narcissism in a way that maybe the East, in some ways, can perpetuate a bit. And I'm still very involved in my Eastern path, but yeah.
No, it's funny you say that, because there's only one other quote that I wrote down from your book, and it was, instead of loving myself, instead of easing up on myself, I double down on yoga.
Yeah.
And I thought, wait a second, so because yoga doesn't have to be about loving yourself or the kind of humility that sort of the teachings of Jesus might point to in certain ways that other kinds of yogic teachings don't.
Yeah, I ended up, today I kind of agree with some things that I've read in Carl Jung, and I'm just very a naive reader of Jung, but he was skeptical that us Westerners could really get the high-level teachings out of the East, that we were ready for it. And so, some things like you'll see Alan Watts talking about how you are God, and I believe that's true, and yet that also for us Westerners is something maybe we don't need to hear before we kind of work through our shit and find our own sense of how our own narcissistic traits are part of our problem,
I hear that. I think that's one way to see it. That's the kind of question it's been a real dividing line for me personally, what you just said, that there are teachings within the umbrella of yoga that teach what you just said, you are God. I have come to believe that that's not true. I actually think that's essentially what Adam and Eve were tempted with at the tree of knowledge. You get to be God. And I think that for me, I'll only say for myself, there's something bigger than me.
Yeah.
And I've kind of been exploring what that is and whether that's like kind of like a universal force or morphic resonant field, or whether that's an actual creator being, has been a big area of inquiry for me personally. But one way or another, and it certainly comes through in your book, that if it's all on you, like if you don't have anywhere to get support from, other than the material world and your own wits or whatever, it doesn't feel doable. At least it hasn't for me. I mean, it becomes a life of, I don't know. It's a very different life than a life that has faith, where you feel supported by something bigger.
Yeah. In fact, last winter, Nick Cave was on Being podcast, and it's such a great episode. I don't know if you've heard it, but
but I saw him when he came to New York, and then in the pandemic, we went and wore masks to see him. Which
I saw him last year too, and he's just amazing.
Yeah.
But he's kind of a troubled Christian now. I mean, he's and he's embracing religious but not spiritual because of a certain rigor to religion. And even though he doesn't fully, he has his doubts big time. But he also talks about, like, the whole Freudian stuff about, we need to look at all of our defenses and we need to try to eliminate them or whatever, or see them. Nick Cave just said, what's wrong with having a crutch? And why do materialists need to go around kicking the crutches out from people, And so that was powerful to me.
Yeah, I hear that. I think that's true, but there's also there's still kind of an underlying thing of that when you refer to it as a crutch, where it's assumed that it's not really real or true. People who aren't strong enough to deal with how horrible life is and the uncertainty of life, they choose to believe these untrue things to make themselves feel better.
Yeah, thanks for calling me out on that. I think that was just his way of talking about it. But for me, it's not a crutch. It's built into us. It's part of, it is stuff we don't understand. Whether you call it mystery or God, and I actually have landed in a place where I sort of see all the different avatars, whether it's, Hanuman or Neem Karoli Baba or Jesus. I'm trying to be more accepting that they're all portals into the one, to the divine, and I can learn from all of them.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I saw that even though you didn't get the message when you walked in the footsteps of Jesus on that trip to Israel, you did go to India and get shaktipat. And we've talked about that many times on the show.
Yeah.
People who've experienced some kind of shaktipat. But I got to say, those people I've spoken to on the show who have talked about that, they were all like believers when they went in there. You seem to not at all be a believer, and against your better judgment, had an experience. Can you say something about what that trip to India and that shaktipat experience?
I mean, I'm very stubborn. I'm stubborn, and I really appreciate how far you've gone in your own journey with Jesus and your own spiritual life. I am a stubborn son of a bitch, and I was, I'd been on the yoga path now for a decade, and I was still dealing with my materialist mind. But I went over to a bhakti retreat in India, and we found out that there was a yogi who was allegedly 100 years old who lived in a cave, and this cave was actually overlooking the valley where Neem Karoli Baba's temple was, and where Ram Das was, and Krishna Das was, and so we hiked up. The first time I was there twice with him. The first time we hiked up, there was 3 or 4 of us, and we entered the cave. We took our shoes off. It was about an hour hike up, and one by one we entered, and we knew we were supposed to bow at his feet, and so I was the last one to enter. And
now, wait, can I stop you?
Yeah.
Before you went in there, what had they told you about this guy? What was your expectation? Were they like, this is going to... Because I went to India looking for a guru too and didn't find him, because there was all these like frauds and doubts and stuff. What was the kind of lead into that moment before you bowed down at his feet?
Yeah. Well, one of our leaders was David Newman, who passed away here just a couple of months ago as a kirtan singer, and he had been there before, and he'd visited with this yogi before, and so he knew about it. It was on a mountaintop, that was again near this ashram, and I was skeptical, like you said. I was I have this habit of like immediately wanting to poo-poo, and I almost didn't go.
Yes, you wrote. I remember this is the passage. You're like, this better be good.
Yeah, my inner voice was like, this better be good, because I at that point I'd done a lot of spiritual seeking and a lot of reading and a lot of meditating, and I was not seeing many results, and in a lot of ways, and I was very cynical as much as I was open, though, and so. Yeah, so when I went into this cave, and as I entered the cave, though, and everything got dark, I knew that I was sort of in a very special place in my life. I was at the tip of the spear. I was something. I was not expecting a shaktipat. I didn't even know that much about it at the time. And
had you ever heard that term?
I had heard the term, and it was just something that I was not expecting to meet a great saint, and it was not something that was on my mind.
You read those accounts and you're like, oh, that's wild, but you don't necessarily think that it might even be real or that it would happen to you.
Yeah, and so I was actually pretty humble about this visit, and I had low expectations about this yogi in the cave, so as I approached him, I bowed. I realized I had my hands on his feet. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask, I'm sorry to keep stopping
That's
you,
all
because
right.
I did read this section, and it's kind of vivid in my mind. You talk about, because I had the only time I ever talked with kind of like a Swami in India, I had this experience of watching someone else have their interview with him before, and the same thing happened. You watched your friends go up to them before. Did you see anything happening with them? Like when they were having their interactions and going over and sitting in the thing, did you notice anything? Was anybody else having big experiences with him?
No, and nobody had any after. And I feel a little weird about talking like that. Like I'm so special that it happened to me, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. People just went, bowed at his feet and shuffled to the side. That was all that happened with them.
Okay.
And
so you went to go do the same thing, and what happens?
Yeah. So as I'm bowing at his feet, my forehead's on the dirt floor, my hands are on his feet, and all I can hear is my breathing, and I'm like, this is weird, and this is I cannot believe, because I had also had this quick thing. I'd also I'll talk about that later, but when I was young, I read a book by it had a character that met with a yogi in a cave. So I had this kind of archetype in the back of my mind. So it was kind of weird that I was experiencing
That's really significant. You had a thing in your past where you'd read about that, and that's where you went in the moment, right?
I know something. I mean, I was not steering this ship. I can tell you that. And so finally, I've been down here too long. I better sit up. And as I'm sitting up, just whack. He just whacked me on the top of the head. It was hard. It was and I'm just like, and I stood up, and I'm like, what the hell just happened? And I wasn't thinking about shaktipat even then. And then he and I made eye contact.
You didn't hit anybody else?
No, we didn't hit anybody else. No. But I was so caught up in this moment, and it was the bigger thing at that moment, though, was when we made eye contact. It just released a flood of tears that lasted like an hour, and it was looking into wisdom. It was looking into a grandfather. It was looking in deep into something I didn't even understand, and I just started weeping, and I wept and wept and wept that afternoon. I didn't stop.
Wow. So had you wept like that before?
No, I mean, I think this was before my healing of the PTSD, where I'd done a lot of weeping in my therapy. For years, I've been in therapy and never really cried much. And this just released. It's sort of like, and I wanted to try to stop it. I write about that too. And I was embarrassed. I kept putting my hands over my face, and it just wouldn't stop. And then it increased, and it was like weeping for decades.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.